Hey, today I'm Flipping Science looking at mutations and genetic variation. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So Science Understands we're going to look at. Mutation is a permanent change in the sequence of DNA nucleotides and is the ultimate source of genetic variation in a species. In a species that reproduces sexually, there are additional sources of genetic variation. So explain the sources of genetic variation in a species that reproduces sexually. Organisms have changed over time. If we look at fossil evidence, we can see that they've changed over time in many different ways. The first forms of life were simplistic and very few in terms of differences between them. But through evolution, we get a wide variety of complex organisms. We went from prokaryotic organisms to eukaryotic organisms, but prokaryotic organisms are still successful, so they hung around. And it happens over a very long period of time. So we've had 3.5 billion years for evolution to occur on Earth. So an example of this is we've got 1 billion years between photosynthetic prokaryotes and eukaryotes evolving. So that's a long period of time, 1,000 million years. Changes in life on Earth are called evolution. So evolution is gradual change in populations over long periods of time. An individual doesn't evolve, but a species does. It explains how life has progressed from very few simple forms to today's huge range of organisms. And the mechanism by which evolution occurs is called natural selection. The first person to suggest it is Charles Darwin here. He came up with it in the 1800s. So, mutations are permanent changes to DNA sequences. And mutations accumulate over time. So here's a question: what can cause mutations? So, mutations can be caused by radiation, mutagenic chemicals, or viruses, and we looked at this a little while ago. Mutations accumulate over time, so for billions of years the mutations have accumulated. Inherited mutations in germ cells, so these are gametes, are responsible for the vast variety of organisms on Earth. So, mutations drive evolution. So, here we have Pac-Man. Pac-Man loves these star-shaped organisms. Pac-Man comes along and eats all those star-shaped organisms, and we're left with the only survivor. So this survivor has genes that are different from the previous organism that allowed it to survive in this environment. And then it's going to reproduce and pass on those genes to the next generation, and the generations after that as well. So over time, DNA got more complex. The circular nucleoid of the prokaryotic DNA became larger and broke into linear DNA with starting points along their lengths so that they could be copied quicker. The DNA itself also became bigger, not just because of the increase in the number of genes, but there's also an increase in complexity. And we have large regions of DNA that don't code for any product, and we refer to that as the non-coding or junk DNA. It's not necessarily junk DNA, we just don't know what it does yet. So we're going to look at dihydrofolate reductase. So what kind of molecule is dihydrofolate reductase? So this something is coded for in a region of DNA that's 31,000 base pairs long. So what is dihydrofolate reductase? So it's an enzyme. The RNA that produces the enzyme is only 1,600 base pairs long. So we've got an awful lot of difference in our number of base pairs from the DNA compared to the RNA. And only 558 of these RNA bases code for the amino acids that are present in the enzyme. So the remaining nucleotides are non-coding, so let's see if we can remember some of the terminology. The sections of DNA that code for the protein are called exons, and the sequences that are transcribed and then cut out are called introns. And here's our picture of that. So we've got our exons that join together to make up the mRNA that leads to the production of the protein. And then we've got our introns, which are that junk DNA that is excised before the mRNA is produced. So we're going to look at genetic variation now. If you're an asexually reproducing species, the only source of genetic variation in your offspring are mutations. And if those mutations are beneficial, they're passed on to offspring, and that's what evolution is. If the mutations aren't beneficial, but they don't cause any troubles, then they'll just hang around in the DNA. And if the mutations are bad, then that could be deleterious, and that could cause troubles for the offspring of that individual. Sexual reproduction, however, provides other sources of genetic variation. So here's a question: can you remember the other sources of genetic variation? So, in meiosis, we have crossing over and independent assortment, so we've gone through those a little while ago. And then there's the big concept of random fertilization. You don't select which sperm and which ova meet fertilization. It occurs at random between the two individuals. So there are millions of ova being produced by a female and millions of sperm being produced by a male, and it's a bit random as to which sperm will meet which ovum. So that leads to a large amount of genetic variation as well. Within your genes, you have alleles, which are the variations of genes. So that means that an organism may express one variation while still carrying an alternate version that can be passed on to the offspring. And this is where we have the idea of dominant recessive alleles coming in. So sexual reproduction speeds up variation of genotypes and phenotypes expressed in a species compared to asexual reproduction. You get a lot more variety produced from sexual reproduction than you do from asexual reproduction. And we can see why that happens down here. So if we're looking at crossing over and independent assortment, so here we have some crossing over occurring, and then we have got independent assortment. It leads to a wide variety of daughter cells in terms of the genes that they are carrying just from meiosis alone. And then when you have fertilization occurring, we have variation with the other gamete as well. That leads to a wide variety. So here we have just two genes. We've got an L gene and an F gene. We've got a dominant and a recessive. So if we're just looking at the meeting of these two partners, we can see the variation that can occur in the offspring in terms of dominance and recessiveness. So even after the offspring is produced, some of them will have variations in their alleles. They won't just be all dominant like this one or all recessive like this one. Many of the offspring will have combinations of dominant and recessive alleles that can then be passed on to their offspring. So let's do our check. So mutation is a permanent change in the sequence of DNA nucleotides and is the ultimate source of genetic variation in a species. In a species that reproduces sexually, there are additional sources of genetic variation, and you need to explain the sources of genetic variation in species that reproduce sexually. So today on Flippin' Science, we looked at mutations and genetic variability. That's it for Flippin' Science today. See ya!